Testing, testing.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the breakout session. This is the CSAIL breakout titled Standards, IEPs, and a Policy of Inclusion for Students with Disabilities. Next slide, please. My name is Amy Stornaiuolo. I am an associate professor of literacy education at the University of Pennsylvania, and today I am going to be moderating the session and both monitoring the panelists' time, but also fielding your questions and some of the Q&A discussion towards the end. Next slide. I wanted to just talk for a minute about logistics. So the audio is muted, but we are monitoring the question box, and we will take questions and answers after we've heard initially from the panelists. So you can put your questions in the questions box. I'm going to be monitoring that, as will all the panelists have access to that as well. And then anything we don't get to in this session, we will take up on our website to make sure we get to all of your questions. Our closed captioning link on the screen is incorrect. So if you need closed captioning, it is on the chat bar on the right-hand side, and you just heard the closed captioner testing that system. So that is the correct link in your chat box. So now, next slide, it's my delight to introduce the moderators for this session. Doug Fuchs is a professor in the Department of Special Education and Psychology and Human Development and conducts intervention research on students with reading disabilities and on forms of service delivery in schools. Lynn Fuchs is a professor in the Departments of Special Education and Psychology and Human Development at Vanderbilt University and conducts research on classroom assessment and on interventions for children and youth with math disabilities. So Lynn and Doug, I'm going to turn it to you, and I will be off camera until later today. Thanks.
Thank you, Amy. Welcome, everybody. We hope you're doing well. So as Amy mentioned, the title of this session is Standards, IEPs, and a Policy of Inclusion for Students with Disabilities. A bit of an advanced organizer here. We're going to try to accomplish 4 things in this session. The first is I'm going to elaborate a bit on an important finding from the comparative interrupted time series design data reported by Mungley Song on state adoption of college career-ready standards. Then I'm going to introduce the 4 panelists. Then I'm going to ask questions of each of them. After each of them responds, we'll open it up for you to ask questions if you choose to do so. So let me turn to Mungley Song's and her colleagues' longitudinal data analysis, because I think that findings from it as it relates to students with disabilities can be a productive basis for the discussion that we're going to have. Mungley and her colleagues. Oh yeah, please, next slide. Thank you. Mungley and her colleagues found that analyses of NAEP data do not support the idea that challenging academic standards boost the reading or math performance of children with and without disabilities. In the next 2 slides, and don't go there yet. In the next 2 slides, we're going to show effect sizes. The first slide is going to show the reading performance of students with disabilities across a number of years. The second slide, their math performance. In both slides, effect sizes, now this is a little complicated, so bear with me. The effect sizes that you're going to see represent contrasts between what we'll call a treatment group and what we'll call a comparison group. The treatment group was states adopting college and career-ready standards in 2010. The comparison group of states adopted college and career-ready standards earlier, most of them 2007. The pivotal hypothesis was that we would see a bump in improved scores for the treatment group in comparison to the comparison group, and in contrast to the comparison group. So for each group, we were looking at an expected change in performance versus their actual change, and we were expecting greater change, greater positive change for students with disabilities in states that had adopted college and career-ready standards in 2010. The reason being that the difference between their earlier, presumably less rigorous standards to now their more rigorous standards would reveal the kind of positive response that lots of folks who support challenging standards would expect. Okay, next slide. So with that as background, what you see, this bar chart, the y-axis is effect sizes, the x-axis is number of years post-adoption. Again, adoption 2010 for the treatment group of states. What these data show pretty quickly and clearly is that there was essentially no difference, was an absence of expected improved performance for the so-called treatment group of states, for students with disabilities in the treatment group of states, as they moved from presumably less rigorous standards pre-2010 to more rigorous standards post-2010. By year 7, if you look at the x-axis, by year 7, there was actually a statistically significant negative effect among the treatment group states, students with disabilities reading performance, marginally significant. Next slide. So that was reading. This is math, and essentially, it's the same pattern in that we do not see the hoped for positive bump of performance among students with disabilities in the so-called treatment group states. And if you look at the green bar, as we go from 1 year post-adoption to 7 years post-adoption, there's a non-significant but suggestive trend that as the years go on, for students with disabilities, the presumed effect, these are correlational data, but the presumed effect of standards might be contributing to poor rather than hoped for better performance. So with that, hopefully that's clear, and with that finding established, I'd like to introduce our panelists. Yeah, let's skip that slide. So I'd like to introduce our panelists. The 4 panelists were not chosen at random. They were chosen because they bring to the table important expertise. And Renee Bradley from the Office of Special Education Programs, Rehabilitation Services, Nicole Bucka, who multi-tiered system of support specialists at West Bay Collaborative. Daniel Espinas, is he with us? Yes, hi Daniel. Is a Washington, D.C. special education teacher. And Mitch Yell should be there. Hi, Mitch. Is the Fred and Francis Lester Palmetto Chair in Teacher Education, University of South Carolina, College of Education. Welcome to all of you. Start with Renee. Renee, here's your question. CSAL findings suggest a disconnect between federal policy, practice, and outcomes for students with disabilities. What's your perspective on this disconnect? And are there strategies in policy or practice for bridging the apparent divide?
Thanks for the question, Doug and Lynn, and thanks for including me on the panel today. As I said in the opening session, we have yet to conquer this policy practice outcome loop. And for years, I have personally struggled with why we failed to implement the evidence-based practices that we know work. I have said many times, having an evidence-based practice is one thing. Implementing that practice on a large scale in a typical setting with typical teachers and typical funding level is a whole different can of worms. I would say the same thing is true with many large-scale policies. We have several examples in education where well-intended policies have failed to be realized because implementation is complicated and far from immediate. Great example today, we're all living. We have a couple of evidence-based practices, right? Wear your mask, practice social distancing. We know they work and they're well advertised. But the actual large-scale implementation of these has been pretty poor. Yes, there is a disconnect. And as I said earlier, I wonder if this disconnect is real and insurmountable, or is it a remnant of our history? Anna Rose's recent graduation from Rowan University and Haben Garam's recent graduation from Harvard have been in the news of late. 45 years ago, would most of us have predicted that a bachelor's degree in television and film for a person with Down syndrome or a Harvard Law degree for a person with deaf blindness? I would say we probably wouldn't have. During the last reauthorization of IDA, there were lengthy discussions on whether or not students with disabilities should or could be assessed like their non-disabled peers. Thanks to the work of Martha Thurlow and her colleagues at NCO, there was evidence from districts and states that not only was it possible to hold students with disabilities to standards and assess them, but it was critical to do that to mark the growth and achievement of this population. Are standards a good idea? I would say yes. Standards help to provide children, regardless of their zip codes, equal access to opportunities. To me, making sure students with disabilities are included in standards and assessments is an equity issue. High expectations for achievement. But I believe that we have fumbled in the implementation of this policy. We have to have a systemic, multi-tiered system of support as the foundation for instruction that recognizes the individual learning needs and provides individualized supports and services to ensure growth and achievement for children with disabilities. The IEP should be the roadmap for children with disabilities for how MTSS should be individualized and what strategies and supports are needed for them to fully access instruction. Following the Andrew decision, the Department of Education wrote in a Q&A, each child with disability must be offered an IEP that is designed to provide access to instructional strategies and curricula aligned to both challenging state academic content standards and ambitious goals based on the unique circumstances of that child. Even for the small population of students with disabilities who have significant cognitive disabilities, we have examples of successes in literacy and numeracy standard aligned instruction through the work of Diane Browder and Karen Erickson. Jim Schreiner also has another example through the IEP Quality Project of how this alignment can work. So is the issue that it can't be done and there's a true disconnect, or is the disconnect that we have not found a way or maybe lack the will to implement the how on a large enough scale? I would posit that the latter is our greater barrier. In 2016, Elliott and Tyndall did a study from the National Assessment and Accountability for Special Ed Center. They looked at reading comprehension growth trajectories for 99,000 3rd through 7th graders on state reading assessments. Controlling for SES, not surprising, they found a gap between children with disabilities and their non-disabled peers. However, what they also found was that the gap at 3rd grade remained fairly stable in subsequent years. So are children with disabilities showing growth? Yes. We may question the rate of that growth, but that's another discussion. But based on this study, how do we lessen the gap? Would investing more money in early intervention and early childhood lessen that initial 3rd grade gap? I would say yes, especially for our students with more significant disabilities. I spoke to the tensions that exist with standards and children with disabilities in the opening session. These tensions are exacerbated because the application of standards for children with disabilities is a joint endeavor between general and special education, as the majority of our children with special needs spend a large part of their time in general education. And I think that we have not yet figured out how to take advantage of the combined, unique, and different set of expertise and skills that both of these professionals have to offer. The need for effective and targeted PD must be elevated. We would not expect to teach a student a quick lesson at the end of the day and expect immediate attainment and fluency, and we should not expect that of our teachers. PD and ongoing coaching, especially around children with disabilities and how to deliver effective individualized instruction aligned with their IEP, college and career ready standards, and focused on high expectations and achievement is an ongoing support need for both general and special education teachers. In your study, there was an obvious disconnect between the state and the locals, what they say is provided in professional development, and how teachers perceive the lack of specificity in the training that they were offered. As I commented earlier, I believe our strongest efforts should be directed at key leverage points. It's hard to change beliefs, but we can choose to create a more supportive, comprehensive system with tiered instruction and support. We can choose to spend our time on the evidence-based practices that we know make the biggest difference. And we can choose to better support our teachers, who are the ones closest to the outcome we are trying to change. And we must do a better job connecting and implementing the policy, instruction, and practice outcome loop. I think we already have a lot of the pieces that we need to connect, but we have to prioritize working smarter to put these pieces together in a way that works better for more teachers and students.
Wonderful. Thank you, Renee, very much. People who are listening in, don't forget you can transmit electronically your questions to us at any time. I am going to move to Michiel. Mitch, we've got 2 questions for you, and I'm going to put them both to you at the same time so you can go from there. The first question is, what are the legal implications of state standards supplanting individualized goals for students with disabilities? And secondly, in light of the Supreme Court's Andrew F. ruling, how should districts and teachers be thinking about what progress for students with disabilities needs to look like?
Thank you, Lynn and Doug, and thanks so much for asking me to be on this panel. Before I actually get into my slides, I just want to mention that both of these questions really have to do with what the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act requires, and that is that we all deliver a free, appropriate public education to youngsters with disabilities. And as Renee just said, the IEP is a roadmap. That roadmap leads to a FAPE, or a free, appropriate public education. Next slide. The first question I want to address real briefly is, what are the legal implications of the state standards for supplanting individualized goals? And what I want to do is make a reference to a U.S. Department of Education Dear Colleague letter in November 2015, in which officials wrote that a free appropriate public education, or FAPE, to make it available, a student's IEP must enable a student to advance appropriately toward attaining his or her annual goals and allow a student to be involved in and make progress in the general education curriculum based on the state's academic content standards for the grade in which the student is enrolled. Next slide. Now, the U.S. Department of Education officials also in this letter wrote, we expect annual IEP goals to be aligned with state academic content standards for the grade in which a child is enrolled. This alignment, however, must guide but not replace the individualized decision-making required in the IEP process. Next slide. Now, I've seen and experienced standards-based missteps, which include developing IEPs that include goals for general education curriculum classes in which a student participates, for example, having social studies goals or health goals in the IEP, and also substituting a state's content standards for an individualized goals. And what I mean by that is literally doing a cut and paste, cutting state content standards and placing them in the goals section of an IEP. Next slide, please. Now, clearly, the IEPs that we develop must be standards-based. That includes developing our ambitious and individualized goals that enable a student to make progress, appropriate in light of his or her circumstances, address relevant prioritized skills from within the standards. So in effect, the IEP must be what Maggie McLaughlin referred to as standards reference. And we must also include accommodations and modifications to enable the student to be involved in the general education curriculum. Next slide. Now, so what are the legal implications of state standards supplanting individualized goals? Well, as my friend Jim Schreiner and his colleagues have said, students' IEP should be standards-based but not standards-bound. In other words, we inform our IEP team deliberations using the state standards. We don't, however, replace individualization in that process. Now, next slide, please. The next question I'm going to answer is, in light of the Supreme Court's ruling in Andrew F., how should districts, administrators, and teachers be thinking about what progress for students with disabilities needs to look like? Next slide. And of course, that question, Andrew F., of course, refers to the U.S. Supreme Court's ruling in March 22nd, 2017 in Andrew F. v. Douglas County School District. And in this case, the U.S. Supreme Court unanimously ruled on the issue of FAPE, further defining what exactly a FAPE is. Next slide, please. Now, in the opinion, which was written by Chief Justice John Roberts, he wrote that a student's IEP must be reasonably calculated to enable a student to make progress appropriate in light of his or her circumstances. And in an interesting comment in the Supreme Court's decision, Roberts wrote, a reviewing court may fairly expect school district authorities to be able to offer a cogent and responsive explanation for their decision that shows the IEP is reasonably calculated to enable the student to make progress appropriate in light of the child's circumstances. Next slide, please. Two takeaways from the Andrew F. decision in developing a FAPE. Number one, the Supreme Court focused on the individual needs of a student, which is at the core of the idea. And number two, the Andrew F. Court, the Supreme Court rejected the so-called de minimis or trivial standard for determining educational benefit, which is necessary for a school district to meet the FAPE standards. And this new standard, this greater standard, is the progress appropriate in light of the student's circumstances? Next slide.
Just a quick time check for you, Mitch.
Okay. Okay, the next slide is the burden of proof with respect to a student's progress shifted to school personnel, because usually the burden of proof is on a party bringing the lawsuit. So if a parent brings a hearing or goes to a court, the burden of proof will be on them. However, this interesting little sidelight by Chief Justice Roberts in the decision that school authorities must be able to offer a cogent and responsive explanation for, is this IEP reasonably calculated to provide benefit, seems to be shifting somewhat the burden of proof with respect to student progress toward school districts. Secondly, will school district officials begin to settle FAPE cases more quickly when there's no data collected to show progress, or when the student's IEP goals are not measurable? So next slide, please. So what does student progress look like in light of Andrew F? Well, first, we have to conduct relevant and meaningful assessments of all of a student's needs. Those needs must be included in the present levels of academic achievement and functional performance statements, and those statements can serve as a baseline, should serve as a baseline in monitoring student progress. Secondly, we need to develop ambitious, measurable, and individualized annual goals that enable a student to make progress and appropriate in light of the student's circumstances. Third, adopt and implement research-based special ed services and programming that make progress more likely. And finally, to collect objective data to show that a student is making progress, and then use that data to inform instruction. And in my last slide, what I wanted to just point out is, in light of the Supreme Court's ruling in Andrew F, how should districts, administrators, and teachers be thinking about what progress should look like? To answer that question, I think we only need to look at this quotation, again from Andrew F. The IEP must aim to enable the student to make progress. After all, the essential function of an IEP is to set out a plan for pursuing academic and functional advancement. So, next.
Doug, you are muted. Sorry.
Thanks, Mitch, for that informative set of answers. So we turn to Nicole. Nicole, your question is, based on your experiences working with practitioners, what do you see as promising methods for easing the tension that Renee and Mitch have already alluded to? Tension between the ideal of universal standards, that is state standards for all, versus the principle of individualization as reflected in the individualized educational plan. So we're asking you, because of your extensive experience with practitioners, to weigh in on this.
Thank you. I appreciate the opportunity. Next slide, please. So I reflect on this both as an educator and someone who now works with MTSS, technical assistance in training at the state level, and as well as a parent of 2 children with special needs. To realize the vision of college and career readiness and a policy of inclusion would be systems change. You know, it would be culture change. And we know from 30 years of research, implementation science, that there is a formula to effective systems change. And I heard earlier when we started this talk that we're not seeing the improved outcomes that we're hoping for. And this formula would say if any one of these pieces is not intact, we will not see the improved outcomes. So if we start here on the left, you know, the formula goes very simply. If we do these practices, what research says should work, and we do it the best we can as compared to research, which is the next box, effective implementation, then we are moving towards effective outcomes. But these 2 things in and of themselves are not enough. We also have to have the third box here, which is an enabling context. And what that means is that it's not just the teacher or the practitioner level that we think about, but it's also the building level, the state level, the district level, that these contexts remove barriers to implementation. Next slide, please. So let's start with the formula. Okay, so college and career readiness, policy of inclusion. What is that practice? defining that practice with a level of detail that it can be implemented, measured, and the fidelity checked is really critical. Next slide. This metaphor helps me. I hope it will help you. Let's talk about swimming. So college and career readiness has not said that it's not enough to say all kids can swim and all kids can doggy paddle and tread water. We now need high levels of swimmers, competitive swimmers, skillful swimmers. And the policy of inclusion says the children that arrive to learn how to swim are at all different levels. So it's not a question of the what, right? The what is the end goal. That's the standards. We want all kids to be high level swimmers. The question is the how. So if we take those kids that cannot swim and we just drop them in the pool, drop them in the ocean, will they learn? No. If we take those kids that cannot swim and we give them a life preserver and let them float around in the pool surrounded by kids who can swim, will they learn? No. Some people define college and career readiness and inclusion as just access, as in being there, just exposure, just being around models. When I put forth that they won't learn in that situation, and then the self-fulfilling prophecy, right? You didn't think those kids could learn, and now they didn't. Next slide. So let's take the same goal, strong swimmers, right? And let's focus instead so much on the what, let's focus on the how. Okay, so first we set up the environment, right? If you've ever been to a swim class, the pool is low. The pool goes from low to a little bit higher. You can see that there's these little little islands. So when they're swimming, they have somewhere to go to, and kids who don't need the islands don't have it. And there's all these tools. We scaffold, we set up the environment for success, step-by-step instruction, model, and distributed practice. We need to move from just dropping kids in the pool to teaching people how to be swimmers. And for students, and this is just all kids, this isn't students with disabilities. Students with disabilities might even need some more. You can see on the left, that's my son who's nonverbal and alt assessed. He has a visual schedule and he does his swim lessons both privately and then he joins the large group. Next slide. So we need to focus on the how, and we need to implement those practices. Now, I would put forth that most professional development around the standards has been on the what, the standards themselves. It has been, even looking at curriculum, has been, do they align to the standards? Not, do they have evidence-based instructional pedagogy built in? Next slide. So what we need to focus on, the pressure point is tier 1, general education instruction, if it's truly going to be college and career ready and inclusive, would have to include what works for students with disabilities. See the photo at the bottom? We want to move from just sink or swim, or osmosis, learning by osmosis, into it's a real swim class. And if we can do that, then on the right-hand side, students with IEPs will truly have a least restrictive environment. Their access won't just be exposure, it'll be meaningful. And that role is the general education teachers. Now, they don't have the skill set yet, but that's where it needs to live. If that lived there, then the special educator could truly focus on specially designed instruction, and the IEP could become live and more dynamic. In my experience, what's been happening is the special educator is consumed with being the life preserver for keeping the child from sinking, rather than able to do specially designed instruction. Next slide. So you might be saying, that's great, nice theoretical stuff, Nicole, thank you. What does that look like? So here are some practices just as examples of quality research that came out of special ed that works for all kids because it has evidence-based practices built in. So I don't have a lot of time, but here are some examples. Peer-assisted learning strategies in both reading and math. You have inclusion, they're included with all their peers, it's a whole group instruction, disabled with non-disabled, and it builds in the research-based practices that assist these students. Next slide. These practices help more than just kids with disabilities. This is across my entire district when I was a district coordinator. This is the percentile growth in all math classes. You can see we hovered around a little bit above 10. The PALS classroom is on the far left, and you can see it's at 45. This is all students, not just students with disabilities. Next slide. So another example is teaching academic vocabulary. So that's in the standards. So people will focus when they train on the progression, and that you need to do that. They don't tell teachers how to do it. What are the routines? So you do this whole group. A lot of our pilot work on academic vocabulary and science had a lot of partnered work and group work. And you can see we built in some solid evidence-based practices that help all kids, not just students with disabilities. Next slide. So from our practice data, you can see here business as usual was on the left. White line is when we implemented academic vocabulary. Students with disabilities are the red and the green lines. You can see when it was business as usual, students with disabilities were flatline, big achievement gap, right? Once we started implementing academic vocabulary routines, all kids grew because again, research might start in special ed, but it usually works for all kids. And then you can see the red line, the achievement gap was closing for students with disabilities. Next slide. I don't have time to speak to this, but cognitive science advances like SRSD writing and schema-based instruction and word problems, I would put into this category as well. Next slide. So finally, we have to figure out what is the IT. I would say it's pedagogy that works for students with disabilities and all, then we have to implement with coaching. And then finally, the context has to enable, meaning removing barriers. And we get that, as Renee mentioned, with the policy practice feedback loop. Next slide. So I don't have a lot of time, but two major barriers. What I described here, that role of general education and the general education administrator, we all know they're not prepared to do that. They're not trained, right? Certification training doesn't go beyond the compliance to the IEP, if that at all. They don't know evidence-based practices in special education. And if they do, it only lives in special ed, right? Special ed research goes to special ed journals, only goes to special educators. So we have to de-silo that. And then finally, everybody mentioned the use of time. I can't say that enough. So the school schedule, right, limits our ability to do these practices. And why? Why? Because state policy above that might be unaligned, and that becomes a barrier, right? Does the child get intervention? Or is their IEP serviced? We only have one time a day to do both, okay? And some of that is also made worse by funding silos. So I tried to go quick, but this is where I see barriers.
Thank you, Nicole. That's a wonderful description of promising practices. And so far, you're 3 standard deviations ahead of everybody, including me on graphics. Okay. And finally, we turn to Danielle Espinas, who is a wonderful special education teacher in the Washington, D.C. public schools. Danielle, 2 questions for you. First, as a special ed teacher, what strategies do you use with your students with disabilities to manage the tension between standards-based reforms, quote, the same challenging expectations for all, versus special education's principle of individualization? And secondly, how do you try to ensure that your students have meaningful access to standards-based general instruction while you're addressing their individualized learning needs? This is very much rooted in Mitch's wonderful presentation that attempted to argue that it's not either or, but somehow a marriage of both. To you.
So thank you for the question. Thank you for including me in this panel. I agree completely that it's of critical import that we find ways to effectively merge standards-based and college and career readiness instruction with special education, rather than to treat them as separable opponents. Undoubtedly, this will require great coordinated efforts on many fronts. But to this end, I think that a good place to begin, as Dr. Yell mentioned, is with the individualized education programs. For if students' IEPs are not aligned to grade level standards, we can never really expect them to meaningfully move towards college and career readiness. So I'd say that the alignment process begins with present levels of achievement and functional performance, or the PLAF statements. The PLAF statements, as the name implies, should detail a student's performance level within specific educational domain. Quality PLAF statements, as Dr. Yell mentioned, should include at a minimum multiple sources of data. So in the area of reading, for example, I have to include data from screening, progress monitoring assessments, classroom observations, work samples, teacher interviews, etc. As it relates to alignment, I present these data through the lens of a standards-based framework. That is, based on these data, I try to answer the question of how my students are performing in relation to their grade level standards. In 5th grade, for example, I might ask, if my student's able to independently craft an opinion piece with a clear topic, logically ordered reasons, backed by evidence, linked together with transition words, can my 1st grader independently count to 120 when starting at any number before 120? In considering students' ability to independently meaningfully access general education content, such questions I think are imperative, but too often are not really included in students' PLAF statements. But also, as Dr. Yell noted, we can't be bound simply by these standards. Students certainly have needs that may extend beyond these parameters. And for example, last year when I was working in Pre-kindergarten, I had several students work in toileting, which is not included in any college and career readiness standards, but certainly an important functional needs that needs to be addressed. Assessing and describing my students' performance within the standards-based framework also provides much greater instructional utility than simply reporting decontextualized test scores. So for example, although stating that my student achieved a standard score of 70 on a reading comprehension test would certainly reveal a pronounced difficulty, it would provide little insight into what specifically her strengths or difficulties are, or what instruction should entail for her. By grounding students' PLAF statements within the full range of grade level standards, I think we're better able to identify strengths that need to be cultivated within our students, as well as specific areas of difficulty that they may require specialized support with. This framing makes it easier then to link students' IEP goals and objectives with specific standards in mind. I think, well, in my experience, it's also forced me to extend my instruction beyond the focus on foundational skills to also the critical thinking and rich knowledge building experiences so critical for college and career readiness. The benefits of standard line IEP, though, are limited, of course, if not implemented with effective instructional approaches. To this end, special educators fortunately have much to draw from in the form of evidence-based and high leverage practices. These have been usefully cataloged and evaluated on sites such as National Center of Intensive Intervention, Whatworks Clearinghouse, and others. The Council for Exceptional Children also recently released a comprehensive set of recommendations for effective special education practice. Pairing a standards-based IEP with evidence-based instructional practices offers, I believe, a viable solution to begin closing the frustratingly persistent gaps in achievement so unfortunately common in special education that Dr. Bradley discussed. To conclude, as I think your survey results reveal, the field is unfortunately far from realizing the vision of college and career readiness for students with disabilities. As with other policy reforms, many coordinated actions are undoubtedly needed to achieve this goal. From my experience, meaningful alignment between students' IEPs and their grade level standards is an important and perhaps easy first step toward this end. And if paired with evidence-based and high leverage practices, there's great potential in this approach to substantially improve the instructional experiences and educational outcomes of students with disabilities. So from here to there are certainly many dots that need to be connected, but fortunately, I think the survey results and the broader work of CSAIL have helped elucidate some of the challenges ahead and brought into clearer focus a path forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Daniel, very much. That concludes the extemporaneous answers to questions that we've put to each of the panelists. And Amy, do I turn it over to you now?
Yeah, that would be great. We only have a couple of minutes, but I have a couple of questions that I think we can get to before we end that might be helpful. One is connecting a couple of the presentations. And so Scooter writes that Renee said that more money is needed, right? So Nicole, in your formulation that you offered, which part of the formulated triad do you see as needing more money?
So maybe we should let Renee first comment on that, the reference in there.
Yeah, I can't remember saying that we needed more money, but I definitely think that that's probably connected to needing more professional development, which we can't have without more money. So I think that's a logical step. You know, I like to try to focus on things that we can control instead of things that are out of our control. And I think for many schools and districts and states, especially in the current situation that we're in come fall, are going to be really strapped for money. But we do have really great examples around the country of how schools have redistributed their teacher FTEs to make the teacher's time more valuable in serving students. So is there, I would suggest that we look at other ways besides waiting for a windfall of money, especially in given circumstances, to address some of the things that we've talked about.
Thanks, Renee. Nicole?
Okay, so I think the question had to do with the formula. I think that and I agree, I think that the funding would come into play for the professional development, which is the implementation piece. What we find in our state is not only do we not have money for training, we also don't have money to cover substitutes or have substitutes to then hold trainings during contractual hours. So, you know, I think that lives there, but also in the enabling context. And so I don't know if you remember, but on that last slide, I had funding silos. So sometimes we have the money, but we don't think we're permitted to use it certain ways, or I find that administrators are doing funding decisions kind of in their own little vacuum, as opposed to like a more coordinated approach. And so, you know, for example, like using EIS funds in one way or another. So sometimes I think that that's part of that practice to policy feedback loop. They think they need more money, but sometimes we actually just need to be more flexible and systematic about how we use our money.
I think that's all the time for questions we have, but we have some really interesting ones that we will answer on the website. So we'll pose them to our panelists and we'll compose some answers and put them online. So Doug and Lynn, I don't know if you want to wrap up at this moment.
Yeah, I'd like Lynn and I would both like to wrap up by first thanking again the panelists. I hope the audience appreciates the not just the expertise of each of these individuals, but the time they took to come forward with I think a very informative and helpful set of answers to really important questions. And then secondly, Lynn and I thank you, the audience, for your interest. If you'd like to continue this with any one of us, you can. The panelists have already agreed, and Lynn and I are certainly willing to interact with you online. And then finally, we wish that you continue to be safe, and send our best wishes to you.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. So before you go, I just wanted to remind everyone that our closing keynote session with Andy Porter and Linda Darling-Hammond begins in 15 minutes, so at 1:30 p.m. Eastern. And if you haven't registered yet, you can go to our website, ccl2020.org/sessions, and get a link to be able to go there. A number of you asked about resources that were available. So all the resources will be available, including a recording of this webinar on our CCL site, but also our answers to questions. And we had a question for Renee about making available some of the studies that you mentioned, and we can also include those on our website. So thank you all very much. We'll leave this screen up, but we encourage you to come back in 15 minutes to that other session. Thank you all, panelists.
Thank you. Thanks. Oops.